Sony had the easiest retro console win imaginable, and somehow turned it into a clearance bin disaster. Nintendo had already proved the market existed. Millions of players wanted a tiny box filled with childhood memories. Sony had the brand, the games, and an audience old enough to spend $100 on pure nostalgia. If you want more stories about gaming's biggest nostalgia bets and misfires, subscribe to Cartridge Graveyard. But only weeks after launch, the PlayStation Classic was being heavily discounted. Soon, the machine designed to celebrate PlayStation's legacy became a symbol of how not to sell the past. And the strangest part? The missing games were not even its most damaging mistake. That came later, when Sony accidentally taught customers that the PlayStation Classic was not worth its own price. To understand how badly this went, you have to remember what Nintendo had just accomplished. 99. It looked like a tiny Nintendo Entertainment System, included 30 games, and connected directly to a modern television through HDMI. But Nintendo underestimated demand, so the little machine disappeared from shelves almost immediately. Resellers smelled blood. Prices exploded online. That scarcity turned a nostalgic toy into an event, so when the SNES Classic followed in September 2017, Nintendo pushed the formula further. It included 21 games, 2 controllers, and even the previously unreleased Star Fox 2. By March 2018, Nintendo had sold more than 5 million units. That changed the retro market overnight. Mini-consoles were no longer cheap plug-and-play toys sitting beside supermarket batteries. They were collectible time machines. The hardware had to look right, the menu had to feel special. Most importantly, the games had to tell the story of the original machine. Sony appeared perfectly positioned to dominate that formula. The original PlayStation launched in Japan on December 3, 1994. It helped drag gaming out of the bedroom and into popular culture. PlayStation ads were strange, cool, and occasionally terrifying. CDs gave developers more storage and publishers lower manufacturing costs, so players got games filled with music, video, and voices that cartridges struggled to match. By the end of its life, the original PlayStation had sold more than 102 million units. For millions of us, that gray box was the sound of a disc spinning behind a closed lid. It was a memory card with 15 precious blocks. It was arguing over who got the next match in Tekken. It was the startup sound that made an ordinary television feel like a portal to somewhere slightly dangerous. So when Sony announced the PlayStation Classic on September 19, 2018, the pitch almost wrote itself. It was 45% smaller than the original console. It included 2 full-size controllers, HDMI output, and 20 built-in games. 99, and the release date was December 3rd, exactly 24 years after the Japanese launch of the original PlayStation. Perfect anniversary, perfect audience, perfect moment. At least, that was how it looked in the commercial. The problem started with the game library. Sony's first reveal created confidence because each title seemed to represent a different part of PlayStation history. Final Fantasy VII supplied the blockbuster role-playing game. Tekken 3 carried the competitive nights in front of one television. Ridge Racer Type 4 brought speed and style, while Wild Arms and Jumping Flash suggested that Sony might also make room for stranger corners of the catalog. That was a promising foundation. Final Fantasy VII was essential. Tekken 3 was one of the console's defining fighting games. Ridge Racer Type 4 still looked stylish enough to wear sunglasses indoors. When the full selection appeared, the excitement cooled. Metal Gear Solid gave the box genuine historical weight, because few games better represented PlayStation's cinematic ambitions. Resident Evil Director's Cut showed how the console helped define survival horror, while Oddworld, Abe's Odyssey, and Rayman recalled an era when 2D games were becoming more expressive rather than simply disappearing. Twisted Metal brought chaotic multiplayer, and Super Puzzle Fighter 2 Turbo offered the kind of game that could quietly consume an entire evening. So the problem was not that Sony had included nothing good. The problem was that every unusual choice made the missing landmarks more obvious. The original PlayStation had an enormous library, which meant every slot carried a cost. Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six took one of only 20 places, so customers naturally compared it with the games left outside. The original Grand Theft Auto had historical importance, but its inclusion also emphasized that Sony was celebrating where a famous series began, rather than the PlayStation experiences most people actually remembered playing. Revelations. Persona mattered to the genre's history, but it was not the version that lived in the memories of most casual buyers. Those choices created a larger consequence. The box stopped feeling like a portrait of the PlayStation and started feeling like a licensing negotiation. Without Gran Turismo, the best-selling game on the original system. Sony had removed one of the clearest symbols of its mainstream success. Without Crash Bandicoot or Spyro the Dragon, the machine lost the colorful mascots that had introduced millions of younger players to 3D worlds. Removing Tomb Raider weakened the story of PlayStation as a cultural phenomenon, while the absence of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater erased part of its connection to music, skateboarding, and the end of the 1990s. Even Wipeout and Castlevania, Symphony of the Night, represented more than 2 missing games. One captured the nightclub cool Sony had built its image around. The other showed how old genres could be reinvented on new hardware. Leave all of those experiences out, and the result was not merely an incomplete list. It was an incomplete identity. Licensing obviously mattered. Crash and Spyro had recently received modern remakes. Music rights could complicate Tony Hawk. Some publishers were selling their own retro collections, but customers do not grade a nostalgia product on licensing difficulty. They look at the menu and ask one brutal question: does this feel like my PlayStation? For many people, the answer was no. Nintendo's mini-consoles felt curated because their libraries created a recognizable picture of each system, even when a personal favorite was missing. The PlayStation Classic felt more like Sony had invited 20 guests based on who answered the phone. Still, a strange library could have become a cult favorite. The machine had Metal Gear Solid and Final Fantasy VII, so the games already inside the box should have carried some weight. But Sony made a technical decision that damaged those games too. 9 of the 20 titles used their European PAL versions. During the original PlayStation era, North American and Japanese games generally targeted a 60 Hz television standard, while European PAL televisions normally operated at 50 Hz. Poorly optimized PAL conversions could therefore run slower than their NTSC equivalents. That mattered because timing is not a tiny detail in a fighting game or racing game. It is the game. Tekken 3 used the PAL version, so one of the collection's strongest titles could feel slower than North American players remembered. The same decision affected Ridge Racer Type 4, which meant a game built around speed arrived carrying an avoidable performance compromise. Grand Theft Auto, Cool Borders 2, and Resident Evil Director's Cut were affected as well, so the issue spread across several genres instead of remaining an isolated mistake. Imagine buying an official celebration of PlayStation history, connecting it to a modern American television, and discovering that Tekken 3 feels like somebody quietly turned gravity up. This was not a fan-made box assembled from mystery ROMs. 99 product made by Sony. So the use of PAL versions created a much bigger problem than slower gameplay. It suggested that the details had not been treated as sacred, and nostalgia products live or die by details. The emulation did not rescue the experience either. Sony used PCSX Rearmed, an existing open-source emulator. Using open-source software was not automatically bad. Good emulation is good emulation, regardless of where it begins, but reviews reported visual glitches, inconsistent performance, and input lag. Combined with the PAL issue, the package felt less polished than buyers expected from the company that created the original hardware. The interface made that feeling worse. Nintendo had wrapped its mini-consoles in charm. Their colorful menus made selecting a game feel like opening a small museum, while save states and display filters made old titles easier to revisit. The PlayStation Classic menu was functional, but plain. You could create a virtual memory card save or use a resume point, but the limited options gave players little reason to explore. There was no substantial archive of artwork, no deep historical material, and very little context around why these 20 games mattered. It displayed the memories. It did not frame them. Even the controllers became controversial. Sony included 2, which was generous, and they were convincing recreations of the original 1994 PlayStation pad. But because they were not DualShock controllers, they had no analog sticks and no vibration. Historically, that made sense. The first PlayStation controller did not have analog sticks. The DualShock became one of the most recognizable parts of the system's identity, so excluding it had consequences far beyond the shape of the pad. Ape Escape could not appear at all because analog control was fundamental to its design, while later 3D games built around smoother movement became awkward candidates for the library. Sony had chosen historical accuracy for the controller, but the rest of the product was already mixing regions, years, and versions. So the decision felt less like a coherent vision and more like another limitation. I understand the appeal of that original digital pad. Hold one today, and your thumbs remember things your brain has forgotten. But after an hour, Your hands may also remember that ergonomics in 1994 could be a form of warfare. The PlayStation Classic launched on December 3, 2018. At $100, it cost twice as much as the NES Classic's original price, and $20 more than the SNES Classic. But it did not offer twice the polish. Its library did not tell the strongest possible story, its software did not preserve every game properly, and it did not even include a USB power adapter in every region. Reviews landed with a dull thud. The hardware looked fantastic. The controllers felt authentic. Some included games remained undeniable classics, but every compromise gave buyers another reason not to spend $100 immediately. So they waited. 99. That reduction rewarded everyone who had hesitated, so even more customers learned not to buy. 99. During later clearance sales, it could be found for roughly $20 to $25, though prices varied by store and country. Here was the final mistake, and it was the one Sony could not undo. The discounts did not merely make the PlayStation Classic cheaper. They told the public that the original price had been fiction. Anyone who paid $100 felt punished for buying early. Anyone still considering the machine learned to wait for another cut. So every red clearance sticker made the product look less like a collectible and more like unwanted inventory. That was the open secret behind its rapid collapse. Missing Crash hurt because the library felt incomplete. PAL games hurt because the included classics felt mishandled. Weak emulation hurt because the package lacked first-party polish. But the falling price transformed those individual complaints into a public verdict. Sony had not simply overpriced the PlayStation Classic. By cutting the price so aggressively, it destroyed the urgency that nostalgia products depend on. Ironically, the machine became more appealing after the price crashed. Its USB ports and accessible software attracted modders, so owners added games, changed emulation settings, and built the library Sony should have delivered. At $20 or $30, it could be a fun little project. But that is a very different legacy from the one Sony intended. The machine was supposed to celebrate a console that changed the industry. Instead, enthusiasts had to modify it to make it feel complete. Sony had everything Nintendo's mini-consoles needed years to build. A legendary brand, a massive audience, iconic hardware, and one of the deepest game libraries ever created. But nostalgia is not automatic. You cannot shrink old plastic, load 20 ROMs, and expect memory to do all the work. A retro console succeeds when it respects how people remember the original, even when those memories are messy, personal, and impossible to fit into one menu. Maybe that is why the PlayStation Classic feels more disappointing than truly terrible. Somewhere inside that tiny gray shell is the console we wanted to love. Which missing game would have made it feel like your PlayStation again? Tell me in the comments, and if you enjoy stories about gaming's greatest triumphs and strangest failures, consider subscribing. You'll be glad you did.